Our lecturer tonight has a double interest in the art of Gustav Manz, and it's usually those combinations that make for the best researchers, because not only has she dedicated a great deal of effort to tracking down the career and the different developments and pieces of jewelry by Manz, but she also happens, or doesn't happen, but is the great-granddaughter of the artist. So she says that her pursuit of the history, of finding and reconsidering the history started with a call that she received back in 2008 when a jewelry historian who was writing her master's thesis on Gustav Manz, called her and asked her a few questions, and I think that was the beginning moment for her own journey. Laura Mathews is our lecturer tonight, and she has, other than trying to reconsider the history of early 20th century jewelry and the artists who made it the very special chapter in the history of jewelry that it is. She has been a magazine editor, a fiction editor, and book reviewer for the last 25 years. She began her career at the Atlantic Monthly and then went on to work for Glamour, G.B. Putnam's Sons, and Martha Stewart Living. And currently she is the literary editor at Good Housekeeping and serves on the board of the James Merrill House Writer-in-Residence program in Stonington, Connecticut. Before I hand the podium over to her, I also want to thank our sponsors for the lecture tonight, the Thomas P. Johnson Scholarship Fund here at the Cornell, who have helped us bring Laura from wintry, snowy New York to beautiful Florida. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And please help me welcome Laura Mathews.
It is much warmer here, much. So this evening, I've put together a lot of slides that have not been seen by anyone outside our family, and crafted a kind of collage, I guess, of some of the great moments in Manz. I don't know exactly how I turned into the world's greatest living expert on this person. Very few people know, but it's been my passion for the past several years, and I do have a day job, but thank goodness I'm not addicted to Downton Abbey. I use that time to Google, and so let us begin. Gustav Manz was born in 1865 in Germany. He was one of 5 children in the Baden area, and his first ambition was to be a detective, so I think it's kind of appropriate that I've been hunting him down. But he was too short. He was about 5'2", and couldn't pass the police test, I guess. So what do? You go to jewelry school. What else? I think that that area of Germany is very, there are a lot of, there's a long tradition, and he was apprenticed to a goldsmith, and there his story began in jewelry. What you see here is something from a scrapbook that my mother had, and which she inherited from Gustav. The drawings are of, if you can make them out, very Egyptian revival style. They are, the actual drawing is about this size, so it's blown up quite a bit. It's meant to be to scale, and the scarabs are samples, and at the very end there's a pyramid and a sphinx there. And I think that the links are really beautiful, the way he devised that, and so that's one of my favorite pieces, but it's just one of hundreds that are in the book. This is Gustav. He was a dapper gentleman. He was a young adult during the Victorian era. When he finished his apprenticeship, he went to South Africa and worked in the diamond mines there, and the diamond industry was starting to boom. But he got very ill from typhus and didn't like the climate very much. So he came back to Paris, and I think that's where he might have picked up that hat, and spent a couple of years there, and then emigrated to the US in 1891. and began his career in New York. We don't know precisely who he was working for. He did have a workshop right on Union Square, which in New York City at that time was home to what they call Ladies' Mile, and stores like Tiffany and Marcus and Company and a bunch of others were there. And they had some of them had their own workshops, but they also used these independent journeymen who had their skills. And he was a classically trained goldsmith and really knew how to use the metal and mix the metal. And that's about as technical as I'll get because I don't really know it. This is another collage. Can you pick out the real piece of jewelry? They're actually from all sorts of different periods, but you can see that he had a very eclectic range of motifs, which was to his advantage because the styles kept changing and he always seemed to have something that would fit or could be adapted. Here he is with my mother on the far left, who's the person who kept the scrapbook, and you can see he really is indeed short. And there she is again. I'm dwelling on her a little bit because she wrote a biography of Gustav, and without that, we probably wouldn't know a lot about him. She, at the end of his life, interviewed him, and there were a number of facts that she documented, and I call it my treasure map because it has a list of some of the people he made jewelry for: Sarah Bernhardt, Eleanor Roosevelt, Enrico Caruso. We have not been able to locate those pieces, but we are trying to find them. What you see here are a stockbook and a page from his business journal, and this is one of the rarest things you will ever find in jewelry history studies. People simply didn't hold on to account books. They were tossed out. They were seen as just, I mean, it's like you keeping your telephone memo pad with your grocery list. But by some miracle, they were preserved by Gustav's daughter, who had worked for him as his jewelry saleswoman. She's a traveling jewelry saleswoman. And you'll meet Doris a little further on. And when she died, it passed to her daughter-in-law, and it was given to Winterthur, which is a museum in Delaware that specializes in decorative arts. However, it wasn't about silver. It was about jewelry, and jewelry as an area of academic study is very young, and the person had been a docent, and she kind of left it like a baby in a basket. There were 3 of them and a bunch of other things with Winterthur, and they sent it to the library, and there it sat for about 30 years until this young woman decided to do her thesis about him, and she found it. Just some family pictures. He was very close to his second brother, Ludwig, who was the head gardener at the New York Botanical Gardens, which was a handy connection to have when you were sort of one of your specialties was doing realistic fronds and naturalistic jewelry. And this is a little sales record that really set me on this journey. I couldn't figure out well, I knew who G. Manz was, but I couldn't figure out who Clara M. was. I'd never heard of her. And then I did some digging and discovered that she was his niece. And I was inspired to try to track down her family. And this is the ring that was on that that he made for her. It's an iris ring that he made, only he made it with an opal. And one of the descendants sent me this, which was a great help to the research because it showed me that at a certain point he was not just a manufacturing jeweler, but he was a designer as well, and he tried to, I think he was trying to set up probably a sort of a factory with a salon so he could show this. He could also show it to his retail customers, but that was fairly unusual. But anyway, this gives you a sense of some of his motifs. We only have that one plate. I wish I could find the other 11, but we'll keep hunting for it. He also was a sculptor, and he put, it was very common for metalsmiths to make what they call fancy goods, and that would have sat on some Gilded Age gentleman's desk. These are some more drawings from that winter tour record, and this piece up here belongs to a relative, and it's a wild rose gold. Tiffany and Company bought the wild rose ring, which leads me to think that he made a model of this, or this was the model, and then they purchased the design and used it, did with it what they would. This is another family piece, which is interesting because of the bezel setting, which is quite time-consuming, but extraordinarily beautiful. Not the best shot, but I didn't take it. It is a ring. It's a ring that has sort of a, you can see the shank, the way he did the sort of palmette. And I honestly don't know what the stones are because I don't have the listing, but they look to me like they're very typical arts and crafts, not valuable stones. They're a little bit like that group of gems you saw earlier on, loose stones, and that was the aesthetic, not to do valuable stones, but to do things that were sort of pleasing colorfully. I was telling people earlier that this document, which floated up at Winter Tour, kind of knocked me for a loop. It did show that he was aware of Nouveau styles and practiced it for a period. And it actually turns out to be a much more interesting document. We have one of his early business addresses up in the upper left in Maiden Lane, which was in the early 1900s. That was the center. That was where the Diamond District was. And then it turns out that a couple of these pieces were presentation pieces that were exhibited in St. Louis during the 1904 exposition, which was a place for American industry and craftspeople to show up the Europeans, which they just kept trying to do and couldn't for a while. And they would, you know, try. They wanted a Native American tradition in the decorative arts, and of course, one of the problems was that all the people who were really good were German immigrants and people from Europe who had come here for opportunities. So, but they were trying to have a homegrown tradition. It took them a while. So the mermaids, you'll see them again. I've been trying to figure out who this lady is here, but we have a drawing of her somewhere, and she's either Salome or, if that's how you pronounce it, I thought she might be Aurora. He had a very strong interest as a European-trained artist in those classical styles. It was also very popular during the Gilded Age, those references. And actually, I was thrilled when I came into the studio for the first time and saw this Bouguereau painting in the back. This is, some of you can't see it, but a very famous painting by Bouguereau. He was probably the most famous painter of this genre in the 19th century, and an Academy painter, and he liked to do nymphs and cherubs, and there was an amazing painting of a satyr and being administered to by his nymphs. Not totally, but more or less, you got the idea. And it hung over the bar at Hoffman's Hotel, right around the corner from Gustav's workshop, and I kind of try to imagine him going over there to study the forms. This is a design for a devant de corsage, which was a huge wamping piece that ladies would sew to their bodice so they wouldn't lose it at the ball. There is such a one. I wish this were the same one, but this is Mrs. Isaac Stern. She is was the wife of the founders of Stern's department store in New York, which was a huge emporium. And she's just lovely, kind of out there with her gems. This is the mermaid, again, a very garish photo. I didn't take it, but it was for somebody, some other purpose. And one of the ways we were able to link Gustav to it, because they were separated, that photograph and this piece were not together. And they were actually put together by this young woman who did her paper, was that the picture on the piece of on the photograph shows that the stone hasn't been set in it. It was in his workshop. It was a work in progress, and this was the finished final piece. Probably more than one person worked on this piece. It may have traveled to a couple of different chasers, depending on what their specialty was. It's a lot prettier than that picture shows. I like it in its gauzy phase. But you can see there that the stone, there's a pencil mark where that chrysoprase, I think that's how you pronounce it, is that green stone, which was very popular at the time. I love the way she's clutching the cattails, and I love the fact that when you see the actual piece, the decoration continues on the back, which was a sort of a sign of somebody who was certainly proud. And the cattails are great, and it's interesting. A lot of Nouveau ladies strike me as very insipid, but maybe I'm just a little partial. His look very robust, and they have these kind of planes on their face that they're almost, they're just more modern somehow. This is a beautiful piece that's at the Cleveland Museum. It surfaced in London and was matched to entry records for the St. Louis Exposition. Gustav created 25 pieces for a New York jeweler named F. Walter Lawrence, who had a salon down on Union Square, not far from that, the Nymphs and Satyrs. And this piece was identified and then donated to Cleveland, and it is now, they've attributed, they didn't know who the maker was until a couple of years ago, and Courtney was able to give them the verification, and here it is again. It was part of a traveling show. I just discovered that this piece is probably Joan of Arc. There was a wild craze for Joan. Mark Twain loved Joan of Arc. 19th century, not particularly religious people were mad for her. I don't know, it was just, maybe it was like Taylor Swift or something, but she had that long blonde hair. She's wearing her halo, and I overlooked her for a long time, and then I noticed that there were these 3 fleur-de-lis in the hair, and I suddenly thought, oh my God. And Gustav was Catholic, and had grown up in a Catholic tradition, so he knew all the symbols. The stone is an opal matrix, which was one of Louis Comfort Tiffany's favorite stones. I have a feeling that this piece might have been a prototype for what he hoped would be a popular design after she was canonized. She was canonized about 8 years after. He was looking ahead. But at any rate, it was exhibited, if I'm right, and the owner of this piece was a former Tiffany archivist, seems to think it was. She gave me this picture. So I think it's Joan. And there's that lady again, dancing lady. And you can see those stylized, conventionalized papyrus things. At first I thought she was Aurora, but then that didn't fit. Greek didn't fit with papyrus. So now I think she's Salome. Here's another one of those brooches, another pretty thing. This is, again, going back to these cost books, which are just endlessly fascinating, and I'm putting together a chronology of them. This was a Peacock Pendant made for Tiffany and Company, undated, but the interesting thing are all the notes. That's another up in the corner, a little design. The brooch has been attributed probably to Tiffany, but it could probably be Gustav Manz too. There you are, and you can see what's nice about these business notes is you get to see the man-hours that went into the piece, the exact description of the stones, which is helpful if you're trying to identify things that you only have a drawing for. Everything else is some kind of jeweler's accountant or bookkeeping code, and I can't make head or tail of it, but it obviously represented they didn't want people to see what they were paying for materials as somebody looked in their books. These are just some more. This piece was made for Tiffany and Company by Gustav. It's a hand-wrought grapevine. Everybody thinks of Louis Comfort Tiffany and the grapevines, but there were other people who did grapevines, and sometimes they made them for Tiffany. And there's another brooch for Tiffany, these sapphires. And this one is not tied to Tiffany, but we think it's this ring that it's a little dark, but was found in an estate jeweler, and it's also lying on another grapevine. This piece, I mentioned F. Walter Lawrence earlier, is marked for F. Walter Lawrence. Gustav almost certainly made it. It was a presentation piece, a birthday necklace that had all the birthstones, but the birthstone of the recipient was this black opal. It's not a great picture, but it's now in the collection of the Newark Museum, and they've attributed it to Gustav Manz as the maker, which is very, it's not just vanity, it's very helpful when scholars see who the maker is. It helps tie things together. It shows that it gives you just a little deeper insight into where something was made, and you get, with Google and the internet, you can then start to connect things. So for us, it has been very important to get those attributions so we can spend more time looking for things. This was a blueprint that was just a fancy to give to the buyer so that they could remember what the stones were. These are just some assorted sketches for bracelet links, but the piece I really would love to find is this one. I think I mentioned that he, was a cat lover. Maybe not. Well, he was a cat lover. He was known to bring home small felines from the zoo. He was very friendly with the Bronx Zoological Society gamekeepers. And my uncle tells the story that he brought home a wildcat cub or kitten one day so he could study it and draw it. And then there's some other Egyptian motifs going through there. I think those might have been, I'm not sure whether those are cameos. They're pink. This one on the right looks like it has carving. Like I can sort of see a face, if you can see the eyes and eyebrows and kind of I don't know, it might have been a cameo piece. This piece appeared in an article in the New York Times a couple of years ago about Courtney's work, and it's a kind of Renaissance revival. Not a very good picture, I'm sorry, but it sort of has a Persian feeling, which was like those Persian screens and that non-representational swirly stuff that you see in Moroccan art. And I think it was tied to a phase when that was popular. Here's some more swirls. He loved to bury gems inside the gold, and sometimes people call that a gypsy setting, but it's a little more smashed in, I think, in the real thing. I have not found this ring. This drawing was attached to a sales record for Shreve, Crump & Lowe, which is sort of the Tiffany of Boston. However, this is a ring that is signed, intriguingly, M & Company. We've never established that he had a maker's mark. He did sign some of his sculpture in block letters, Manz. So if you see a dog with a bronze Manz on it, call me, because he did like to sculpt. This was made for it's been attributed to the firm called Marcus & Company, who were competitors of Tiffany, but known for, Tiffany is a very conservative company, and excepting Louis, who had all these brilliant women designing stuff for him. But it was very conventional, beautiful stuff, well made, but Marcus kind of followed a more French, tried to adapt that French Nouveau style, so lots of whiplashes. And it's a pretty ring, and it's at an estate dealer's, and every time we go in there, we just think, M & Company, what do you think? Maybe, maybe. Here's a cast of interesting characters. One of the things I've been doing with the cost books is compiling a list of everybody who walked through the door, and there are just hundreds of them. And I got curious. Everybody knows Tiffany and Gorham and Black Star. I was kind of interested in following the trail of people who were less well known, and so I started doing research. And the first person who caught my fancy, whoops, sorry, come back, was this lady here. I had no idea what she looked like, but a kind person supplied a photograph for me. Her name is Eleanor Clapp. she's almost practically the first name in his cost book. His cost books only cover 15 years, and he had worked for a full 15 years before them, but she was the first name, and I took that to be kind of significant, and I wanted to know who she was. And it turned out she was quite fascinating to me. Her story was quite fascinating. She was born into a Quaker family. Quakers not known for their jewelry production, but she fell in love with craft, arts and crafts, and when she married and was living in Chicago, she took classes. I think I have this chronology roughly right. And she decided to start designing jewelry for friends mostly. She was a society woman and not going to go into trade. Her husband was I think he was a dry goods businessman. And so she started resetting stones for friends, which is an old tradition. And she got very good at it and started exhibiting her pieces and won prizes at craft shows, and also was one of I think the only American woman to have her work shown at the Paris Exposition in 1900, which was a big deal, very big deal. So I did some digging and stalking and was able to determine somebody, living person, who might give me some information, and that's how I learned those facts. And she continues to fascinate me because she was, she had a studio where she had young women coming out of Pratt Institute and Cooper Union, and it was really just the very beginning of women of her class having a career outside the home. It's sort of that late 1890s, early 1900s, and because she's successful, and it probably helped that her son was the founder of House Beautiful magazine, where I was able to dig up a little more information about her. She had some standing, and she was very, very good friends with the Pratt family, who had founded the Pratt Institute. I think they were Standard Oil, and very philanthropic. So that was her place. And just quickly, Meriel Corey, a Lebanese-born jewelry designer. She looks like she's quite mystical, and she was quite, she used to give dinner parties according to gem colors. So she famously gave an emerald dinner, and everything in the, on the table was green. And she's a wonderful person. I can't spend too much time talking about her. This person, Edith Douglas Dean, a Vassar graduate. I love that collar. Who needs jewelry, right? That's her, I think, her Vassar senior picture. She also had a decorating business. This woman was not a designer, but she was a diamond dealer, and she was Gustav's mother-in-law. We'll come back to her. Her name was Sophie Baulkham. I think I don't know how old she is. It's very hard to tell. She has this long Teutonic braid, and she's wearing a whomping, I call her the girl with the pearl earring. She's got some huge stone there, and I think it has an eagle taking flight, very Germanic. And this is probably the best known of all of them. This is Sally James Farnham, and she was a sculptor, and I think an acquaintance of Gustav. She certainly bought jewelry from him, and she's of great interest to me because her husband, Paulding Farnham, was the great Tiffany designer of the 19th century, and all of the beautiful Tiffany pieces that come out of that time were designed pretty much under his watch. So it's interesting to me that Sally chose, after she and Paulding divorced, her career also blossomed, and that Gustav was the jeweler she chose to come to when she bought jewelry. So I found that gratifying. This is one of the rings she bought. She was interested in the zodiac. Tiffany had a famous zodiac series. I think it's just coincidence. She was was interested in this motif, though, and she used that in her own sculpture. This is just a quick sketch done at the shop, not something that was to be shown. This is one of many snake rings that he did, and it belonged to my great-grandmother, Sophie Baulkham, the lady you saw earlier. I just threw this in for fun. One of the family lore is that, part of the family lore is that Gustav made 3 pieces that were on display at the House of Jewels in the New York World's Fair in 1939. And so we haven't seen them, found them, but these Park Avenue ladies were asked to model some of the jewels as a publicity gimmick in the 30s. It's a little unchronological, but I couldn't resist those faces. This was another discovery. This bison turned up in a state website, and the inscription is to Marcel Necht from Paul Gillot. Marcel Necht was the French liaison. Basically, he was the public information officer in New York City, meaning spy, between the wars. And Paul Gillot was a designer, jewelry designer. He'd been born in France, and he came to the United States, and he worked at Marcus & Company, the people who did the swirly jewelry. But what really stood out for me was that we had the identical piece in our family collection in the Gillot box, and so I knew who carved it. And I did a little bit of research on him. I love the way Manz, this is a fob that is this big, you know, it's sort of the size of a walnut. So you can see the is that granulation, not crenellation, granulation on it. And it's just, and Gillot, as it turned out, was a very frequent customer. Here he is, looking very, I don't know, Gaulish. He was styled himself as the king of diamonds until Harry Winston took over the title, but he was I think he was probably a wonderful designer and a bon vivant and a steady customer of Gustav's. One of Paul Gillot's customers, does anybody recognize her? Sarah Bernhardt. She didn't look like this when she came to the United States, though. She was quite old when she did her farewell tour, but and she's not wearing a bracelet, so I can't, I'm gonna have to keep hunting for that one. So this is the inscription, and it's just interesting to me that, that now we have a lettering sample, so we can look at that to compare with jewelry. Gown in the Weeds. This is a page from the Craftsman magazine where Gustav was reviewed on occasion, and these are some more of those pieces that went out to St. Louis. The stone, in this case, is glass. It's called Cyprian glass or Phoenician glass. It's an iridescent glass. There was a very famous dealer who was probably a tomb raider and knew all the jewelers in New York City and provided them with this hot gem. It kind of had its moment and then passed, but it looks quite beautiful in the dragonfly thing. And here's an article about the exhibit, first exhibit of that stuff. And these are a little unclear. These are all the same ring. I'll start with the one in the middle. When Courtney published an article, the graduate student published an article in magazine Antiques, one of her friends pointed us to this ring that had been published. And I had recognized it as the same ring as one in our scrapbook. And I thought, wow, that's really, so that's what it looks like. And I don't often get to see an exact match, but it was pretty as close as it could be. And then a little later, this showed up at a place called Tatama in London, which is a wonderful estate dealer. And I thought, wow, brilliant. Here it is again. And then I realized it wasn't exactly the same ring. The stones were different, and it looked like the pearl maybe had been replaced. So I don't know for sure, but I think it's possible that it is the same ring, because these sorts of things weren't mass produced. It took a long time to make them. You know, a craftsman working with a couple of assistants, if their shop put out 50 pieces in a year, that was huge. If it was hand-wrought stuff, it was very carefully made. So I'm inclined to think that somebody took a more valuable stone, possibly, or a stone they liked, or maybe the stone cracked, and then replaced it with this stone, but the jury's out. Oh, however, I have the ring here. and you're welcome to come up after we finish here and have a look at it. More of this kind of thematic stuff. You'll see that, you know, that there's a lot of, Gustav was a literalist, and at the same time a kind of a mythifying character. He didn't do abstract stuff. He liked to follow these classical themes, and he put his own spin on it. This is a dog-tooth pearl collar, which went around a very narrow neck, but probably had an extender, and simply just showing how some of his maneuvers, the cattails and the fronds are very telltale signs. The way he draws fish. This figure is, I'm not going to talk about a lot of clients. This is, I think, the last one. This is Ferdinand Hodes. And Ferdinand Hodes was another person who styled himself as the King of Diamonds, only his territory was Chicago. And he knew Gustav. He was a German immigrant. And I tracked down one of his descendants and said, I think I have some notes that you might find interesting. And it turned out that she was one of the rare people who had saved her grandfather's stock books. And she had, you know, 6 cubic feet of them out somewhere in a secret location. I can't tell you, but she's been going through them, and she fetched up this sale here. It says, I think it says silver cigarette case with buffalo, by Gustav Manz, and the price at the time, the wholesale price was $100, which in I can't do the math, but that was probably pretty pricey. And it was sold to a man named H.L. Mundy, who was a president. He was an industrialist, and that was really Ferdinand Hodes' clientele. She also sent me some drawings, and these are not Gustav's, but they kind of show you again of that technique of having a drawing, a card where you could put the gemstone, and if you were largely a gem dealer, you would want to have a lot of these to give your customers their choice. She also fetched up what was a very important document for us, which showed me Gustav in partnership with Walter P. McTeague, who's I think his great-great-great-grandson is still in the jewelry business. So that was fun. Excuse me? You know Walter? Oh, well, there you go. This particular, and this was just a complete, just reaching out to her, and I gave her a list of names, and this came back to me. The date on this is December 18th, 1908, and I didn't show the whole deal, but what it is a work order for this fine diamond and carved jewelry dealer to put diamonds on a binoculars case for a client whose initials were CKGB and who had a yacht called Vanadis. And so I triangulated those things and discovered that there was also an order concerning a sautoir that is a certain style necklace. So Gustav and Walter McTeague were subcontractors for Hodes for this client, who was CKG Billings, a avid horseman. He loved trotting. Back in the day when the East Roosevelt Drive was a racetrack, actually, and people would go out in their trotting carriages and run up and down, and so that was kind of a fun thing. And the Vanadis was his yacht, and I have a picture of it somewhere. These are more, oh, there's the Vanadis. It's not this one. No, it's this little white one, this little really mingy white one over here. I mean, this is the, it really has nothing to do with Gustav except for those binoculars, and it's very tangential, but this is the river Neva in St. Petersburg. And he was on a goodwill tour. He brought his stable on the boat, I guess people carried their horses with them, took their horses with them. So I just think this was the following spring, and I hope the binoculars were finished in time, because he would have needed them. Any idea who this is? This is Mrs. Manz, soon to bolt with her violin teacher. This is my great-grandmother. Her name was Martha, and she's wearing, I think, a Whitby jet necklace that is in the picture of her mother, who was Gustav's partner. You can imagine it was very inconvenient of her to bolt when her mother was in partnership with her husband. But the marriage was not successful. They had 2 children. She was half Gustav's age. I think Sophie kind of arranged this. And she just did what she wanted and left. She then grew up a little bit. She in this picture, she's about 23 years old, I guess, and she's got 2 young children, and went on to have 2 more children with her violin player, and founded a newspaper and became one of the first women in I guess, the country to own and publish a weekly newspaper in Leonia, New Jersey. So she's there just as the sort of the spoiler. But I knew her and did not know Gustav. So, and it's curious that I never heard her speak a word of him. So these are her parents, Carl and who were in the business. And this is something that happened in the 19th century. There, people, and it happens even now. If you go to the Diamond District, it's like going back into the 19th century, and families are very intermingled. And I think it's only that because Gustav did not have sons, although there were women in the business, a few of them, that I am not standing before you as a bench jeweler today or a diamond dealer. There's Martha in her getaway car. This piece was my mother's, and it's carved by Gustav. Chrysanthemums, there was a Japanesma, I can never pronounce that, period, and I think that might have been made around that time. It's, I think, a cameo of either, it might be a citrine, it's actually an intaglio, it's cut from behind, so you can see it vaguely, and it's set with maybe that's an amethyst, maybe a garnet. I can't remember any longer. And then these little dematoids, and you can see how those gems are stuffed in there. They're not that collet, stiff kind of thing. It's a very naturalistic technique that he liked to do. This is Gustav's youngest daughter, Doris. She was a flapper girl, and she worked as a traveling saleswoman. She took the train down to Palm Beach and showed his samples to Greenleaf and Crosby and places like that. And she worked for him for, 7 or 8 years, and then she married and moved to Cleveland. But she is the person to whom we owe the business papers because she kept them. And after he died, she actually did a little bit of what I'm doing, although she didn't have the internet to help her, and tried to give materials to a museum. She felt that he represented a period that had that was rapidly changing as the jewelry business became more industrialized and mass produced, and he really was one of the last of the old style jewelers. There's her business card, which I think is hilarious. 1920, you just think these things were invented by madmen, but she was working there. I think she was, artistic, but the real fun of that picture, is peeking out on the side, which is George F. Kunz's autograph. He inscribed this book to Doris. She was obviously aspiring to work as a gem dealer, and George Kunz, who was Tiffany's president at the time, was a self-taught mineralogist and quite a fascinating figure. I really don't understand why they haven't made a movie about him, but probably Leonardo DiCaprio will play him. And he was just an amazing figure. And I think, like a lot of these guys who are scientific, he was very successful, and he was sort of the marketing head and the face of Tiffany after Charles died, and Louis was kind of off with his Tiffany studios. Kunz was always, cutting ribbons around New York and interested in the life of the city. But he liked to probably sit around and shoot the breeze with the guys who actually made the jewelry, because it's fun. And I do it myself sometimes when I go over to the Diamond District. It's just kind of cool place. It's a different pace. These are a pair of, they were turned into earrings. They were gentlemen's cufflinks, and you can see the oak motif and the cabochon sapphire, and they're just perfect little round things like that. These are some pieces, again, a sketchbook in his production notes, and a ring, not a very good picture, that surfaced from a family member when I started going hunting. And alas, the ring on the left was lost, but my mother had it appraised, and it too has the same violet leaf. So I study petals a lot. And here's some more of his. And I'm not sure what she went on, but she could be related, could have been an early study for that purse, mermaid purse. The iris ring on the left is Gustav Manz. The iris ring on the right is marked for Marcus and Company, again, with those little curly Q things. And it's possible that he was the maker. Marcus has no business records, so there's nothing, to tie it from that side. This is a morning glory. It's so huge here. It's teeny, teeny, teeny. And that's the watch pin that goes with it. So that's a little detail at the top of a lady's watch. This is a ring that my sister found in the market, and she sort of matched it to a very similar looking ring in his archive. There's a violet that was shown in a show out in the Midwest. We took it out there as an example of his work, and the photograph does not do justice to this. This is mixed gold. It's got a tiny diamond chip that is just perfect. It's not of any great value by itself. It's the right accent. And the texture and chasing on this gold is unlike anything I've ever seen, and the veins are amazingly visible on this teeny, teeny piece. Some more drawings. I think that Gustav's, if there's any link to Louis Comfort Tiffany, it's through the fact that they were working at the same time, and to some degree, Manz shared the same aesthetic as Meta Overback and some of the other designers who worked for Tiffany at that period. This looks like a very 20s kind of ring. It sits low, sits flat and low on the finger, and it's just aesthetically very pretty. So he was making similar kinds of floral rings. This is a nasturtium. The ring on the left was just to show how he used cattails, and the cattails are on that piece out in Cleveland. And then this is a very garish photo of a quite pretty ring that my mother had that has an amethyst, and you can see the little teardrop holes better in other photographs, but it's a nice ring. Oh, there. This is marked for F. Walter Lawrence, and I was in a estate dealer in the Diamond District and got to put it on. This one was retailing for, I think, $12,500, and it has blossoms and is pierced and so forth, and I wish I could have bought it. It went fast. Oh, incidentally, the other ring is also Gustav. That's one of his Silver Panther rings. Some more ring designs, more rings. I think this is the last story I have about finding a descendant, speaking of Walter McTeague. So I had been circling around the idea of getting in touch with the McTeagues, and felt a little bit uncertain because they were in business together. There was a split. I think the split was over the divorce, because that's when it dissolved, and Gustav probably didn't want to be in business with his ex-mother-in-law. And so they went their separate ways. But the other thing was that I think that Walter P. McTeague was largely a diamond guy, and he produced the white jewelry and did really beautiful work. And Gustav really liked carving. He liked gold. He liked the tedious, low, sculptural stuff. And so their paces of what they were doing were very different. And it was the right thing for Gustav to move on and have an independent shop. So anyway, I worked up the courage to call somebody, and Dorothy McTeague, a lovely person who works in the family business, it's the 5th generation now, welcomed me into their office. When you go to a jeweler in New York City in the Diamond District, you walk through double locked doors. It's very, you know that there are safes there, and it's a very, very tight security kind of place. She was lovely. And we chatted for a while, and she had seen this drawing in an article about Gustav in Magazine Antiques, and she said, I want to show you something. And she brought out, not this piece, another piece that had a very similar, and that was gold, not diamonds. And she said, well, this is from the old shop. So I have a feeling that Gustav was making this back in that time period in 1910. Anyway, it was nice to meet her, and we're sort of like jewelry cousins. This is just another sales record for a grizzly bear. I have a bunch of bears here. It was one of his favorite animals. Mammals are not frequent subjects of rings. They're kind of they're not pretty and they're not delicate. But he just loved carving bears, and so he put them on a lot of different objects. And he made one for Tiffany and Company that was a scarf pin, all platinum, which means that it was set with little stones, and you can see there were 34 stones. So if you ever find a bear with 34 diamonds and count them, please call me, and that has Tiffany on it. You'll be well rewarded. Here's just some more bears, and these were door knockers. I'd love to have one of those. Another bear up close. This was the first piece of jewelry outside my own family that was verifiably Gustav's, and it happened. It came into my notice because I know the owner from childhood, but had not seen her for a long time, and I invited her to have tea, and I really wanted to get to the bottom of Gustav's divorce. I was like, well, what happened? Nobody would talk about this. I just curious. So I invited her over. I thought, now maybe somebody will tell me the story. So she came over, and she really didn't know much, but I said, what happened with them? And she thrust her hand out at me, and she said, well, this is Gustav Manz. And I was just shocked because she was not related to him by blood, but she was a niece, and she never takes this ring off, as is clear. It was her father's signet ring. So I was just charmed by the fact that his, the appeal of his ring transcended family fractures. This is another version of the ring, less well used, and it was auctioned a couple of years ago and is now privately owned. And there are just details on it that match his hand. This is a cropped picture of a card holder. People would bring calling cards, and there was just a craze for Arctic everything, Arctic silver and Arctic jewelry, and this was of that period around 1905, 1910. The Bronx Zoo brought home, there was this guy, I wish I could remember his name, he was an adventurer, and he was always capturing live animals and hauling them back from faraway places, and so this was probably to celebrate the arrival of these two polar bears at the Bronx Zoo. That's a piece of crystal, cut crystal. Give it a little Titanic effect. This is a lion and lioness ring, kind of a conventional ring. These are just more cats. Okay, I put a couple of dogs in. Just during the Great Depression, when, and actually during the war, both wars, particularly metalsmiths were hard hit because those materials were intended for bullets, and they really had to scrounge to get the materials. And if you were German during World War I, it was a difficult time, and people were on watch lists, and people who worked in any kind of industrial, handled any kind of industrial material, were carefully watched. So these are the watchdogs of that watched period. This is actually a letter dagger. All right, I think this is my last story about the find of a client. I got a call from a woman who does research on numismatics, which is metal collecting, and she had seen the website. By this time, I guess we're about 3 years into this, and I'd started a little blog and was posting pictures on the web, and she called and said, this is stamped F. Walter Lawrence, and I wonder if your great-grandfather could have carved it. And I said, well, we do have some drawings, and this thing and that thing. And then she sent me the blow-up, and there it was. The first picture wasn't that good. I made sure this one was good. The one she sent me, and hallelujah, there it was. So this was a medal made around 1905 for the French Bulldog Club that was just getting organized. And this is what metalsmiths did in their free time when they weren't cranking out signet rings for Tiffany and Company. There's one of the drawings. This is another Marcus piece. I keep showing Marcus because it looks so like some of the drawings that we have. It's a really pretty piece in the auction. Does anybody know who this is? This is Diana by Augustus Saint-Gaudens. She's standing atop the original Madison Square Garden, a few doors down from Gustav's workshop. And the Madison Square Garden was torn down, and there's an apartment there, which is, does everyone know about Evelyn Nesbit and Stanford White? That was his apartment. He had a little boudoir at the top of, I guess maybe not right up there, but maybe that double level thing in the middle. Anyway, and so the story goes that Harry Thaw, every time he passed that statue, knowing that his wife had been deflowered by Stanford White, just was enraged because he was certain she was an artist model, that she was the one who had stood for this Diana, although actually it's been documented there were 2 other women. The reason I have it here is that I noticed that Gustav was just sort of doing, and he called this his Diana ring. So I just, and it was, it's about, it's a very quick sketch from the production, and I've never seen the ring, but I bet, all jewelers who work in these very precise dimensions are kind of counterfeiters, and they, and they copy things. But what's amazing to realize is that ring, that figure would be, Saint-Gaudens' figure was like 30 feet tall, I think, the original one. This is Diana for the flea circus. And there are some other of these classical motifs. Bacchante. This figure was kept in a box by my mother with some other objects of Manz's, just stuff. And I was joking, or not, I was telling the story earlier to a friend that she always told us it was a chess piece. There was a story in the family that Gustav, to become a life member at the Metropolitan, you had to submit sculpture, and the Metropolitan was a school, in a way, for decorative artists, and people were encouraged, Tiffany sent their whole art department there all the time, so they could do these measurements and reproduce those decorative things. And so the story was that he had carved a chess set, and this was supposedly a missing piece. Well, we'll see. Maybe I'll get a letter off to the Met someday. But it is related to this, Medusa, and some other Medusas. They're little cufflinks, probably, not originally. But he also, the Medusa has Mercury wings, and I can't remember exactly why. I think maybe Mercury helped bring the person who slayed her to her. I love these images. These were two sides of a ring that was also exhibited at St. Louis, and I found them in an old magazine, and the story is too complicated to tell, but I'm 99% sure that these are the ring. And I just think they're beautifully modeled. And here's some other sketches. He also did small silver. That's his Lion King. My sister made me put this in. She said, "You're going to Florida. You have to put seahorse in." Okay. This is the front page of the Jeweler's Circular. In 1924, there was there were a series of industrial art exhibitions at the Met. And they had an amazing visionary curator named Richard Bach. And he gathered together what he thought were the leading craftsmen working at the time to bring their products in. And this was not art, this was applied skills. And it was really, in some ways, a craftsman's time to show off their work. So the piece in the center is Gustav's. The pieces on the flanking it are from another manufacturer at the time, and it was a rave review, which was nice to find. And the piece on the upper right is a terrible photograph. That also is on the front page, but Courtney didn't use it because it was upside down, and she didn't know what it was. So I have learned now to turn things upside down, and you might find a snake hissing, and then a tiger. And you can even see the stripes in certain light. And this is another ring that came up for auction. I don't know who owns it now, but it has these fronds. This is at a state dealer, more tigers. This is in our family collection, and it's a sample. It doesn't have a stone, but I just love wearing it. This is a sterling silver hand-wrought tiger, and it's not a very attractive picture. It's prettier, but you can see the fronds again come up. And this is a forerunner of the Duchess of Windsor's favorite pet. This was just a stick pin, and he put a lot of animals on those. Somebody mailed this ring to us saying, "Do you think this is Gustav Manz?" And well, yeah, I actually did. You can't see all the different things. I couldn't believe how trusting they were. It came from Phoenix, Arizona, and I guess they knew where to find us if we didn't send it back. But we're not in the appraisal business, but once in a while we'll look at something if somebody thinks we might have a drawing to help them. And there is a drawing. This piece was sold at Skinner, and it's sort of representative of a time between the arts and crafts, Art Nouveau, and full-on Art Deco. It's still using representational figures in this kind of what they call a flexible bracelet, diamond bracelet. It's not as geometric as things will get very soon, and it was attributed to Gustav, although I secretly think it might have been during his time with Walter McTeague, because it just has a lot of diamond work on it. So maybe it was a joint effort between them. But here's some of his dragons and that romantic Gothic thing. The piece on the left is actually a section of a fob, which is a watch chain fob, depicting Siegfried from Wagner. There were a lot of representations of theater scenes, and so those were fun for him to sculpt. I would love this ring. Here are a few more of those sort of Victorian ones. This is just the program from that Met exhibit. I'm sorry it's out of order, but you can see the names of some. There were just 7 exhibitors: Charles Albert, Cartier, a couple of estate jewelers, Gustav Manz, Jacob Merlust, and Julius Wadiska were kind of representing the the German contingent, I guess, of immigrant manufacturing jewelers. And here's that blow up of a desert brooch. This is an Eye of Horus, which I think came from his second arts and crafts phase, which was closer to the Depression when he was using materials sparingly. Some more Egyptian stuff. This is a pendant that was in an exhibit called From Here to Eternity, or Here to Antiquity, excuse me. And the dealer attributes it to F. Walter Lawrence. The piece on the right is also F. Walter Lawrence, and it has those curlicues, and it has the papyrus detail. It feels like to me, if Gustav carved it, and I'm not 100% certain he did, it does have a lot of the figures, and I've put them up against other drawings to try to figure out, is that camel the same camel as the earlier one? Is he just a little, is he older? When this was probably made closer to 1924. The other one was made at the turn of the century. I don't know, but I'll gnaw on that one for a while. That's one of his drawings. So there are some motifs. This is a terrible photograph. I'm sorry I didn't have time to get a better one. I'm wearing this bracelet. This was a bracelet that my mother owned, and it's beloved in our family, and he made it for just a small number of people. And my friend out in Wisconsin, whose father was the Ferdinand Hodes, who owned the Maximilian diamond at one point, one of the big Wamping diamonds that come up for sale every once in a while. He sold 4 or 5 of them to various Republicans, I think. The dates on the sales are in, I think it was when Hoover was running. And Gustav wrote in a letter to Doris, I think elephants are popular this summer, so I guess there was some hint of his political leanings. But I think he was making elephants all along. It's just that sometimes things sat in the store. They didn't, the merchandise, the inventory didn't always turn over as quickly. I've seen pieces that were purchased in 1910 that were sold in 1924. I still don't quite understand how you can make a living doing that, but I see it all the time in jewelry stores. Things hang around. This is a piece that it's a copy, or it's one of the. It's the identical twin, I guess, to a piece that he made for Cartier. Cartier loved this Mogul kind of style of decoration, and that's a beautiful pale jade that's translucent. You can see through it when you open, and that's it's a dress clip that you would wear 2 of them on either side, and I love that piece. Excuse me? Oh, and then these are, he also did a lot of work for a store called A.A. Van Teen. He worked at different price points. He had a lot of custom customers, but he also had his studio workers not cranking out exactly, but making these pieces that were somewhat less expensive, and used pieces of jade that could be purchased on the market, and then they would do their gold edition, and it was sold at this emporium that was located not far from where the New York Public Library is. I think it was on 39th Street. They had a huge, huge building there, and so they were known as the Oriental Store, and a lot of items that Gustav made went there. I don't think this item went there, but he did a lot of carving with the Buddha. This ring was made for Tiffany in 1923. So there was another revival, I guess, as sort of Orientalism, and a couple more. This ring has that gaping serpent thing going. It was marked for Durand and Company, which was a Newark manufacturer who produced a lot of Tiffany jewelry. And it's possible that Gustav would have made the model for them that they would then produce in multiples. I just love that picture. It's the strangest, oddest piece of jewelry. there's a Buddha inside, and those kind of lima bean shapes are actually jade, and there's a hinge, and it parts. They're wings. I've never seen anything. I've never seen a real one, but there are multiple drawings in the book. So something like that would have been inside it. It's a Buddha. This belongs to a relative, and actually the person who gave the books to Winter Tour. And here's the Mermaid Ring again. So this is the last story. I went to a jewelry conference a year ago, and it was my third conference, and now we're sort of with my sister, and we're sort of the Manz sisters. You know, the sisters are always going on about their great-grandfather. And we were sitting listening to somebody talk, and across the aisle, somebody started waving this box at us, and it was a goldsmith that we knew, and it turned out that he had a customer who had purchased that mermaid ring, and he had brought it to show it to us. And that's somebody who was at the conference wearing the ring. It's a very tall ring, and it was one of the gifts for us to just be able to see it. Here's a close-up. You can see the similar leaves to that chrysanthemum brooch I was showing you. So it has these lovely little diamonds in it. There it is next to the brooch. So the gold work's very, very similar. It's marked for F. Walter Lawrence, but I think it was designed by Gustav Manz and made by him. And there's the back of it. I have a Pinterest board, and I think the most popular board is what I call clasps and closures, where I put up pictures of the backs of jewelry, because it's so fascinating to see how different jewelers handle that problem, and it's also a great way to figure out how to identify somebody's pieces. So I just wanted to show that. And there's Gustav having a well-deserved rest. I think, David, that might be Rhode Island. I think that might be the Datar House. So thank you. That is...